The old carpenter's hands were shaking the morning they found him weeping in the snow, kneeling before the charred remains of what had been his daughter's only hope. The barn, his masterpiece, his madness, his monument to a promise made at a deathbed, had survived the winter fire. But the cabin he'd built atop it, the one that had made him the mockery of 3 counties, stood untouched. And inside, wrapped in quilts warmed by a mystery no one could explain, his daughter still breathed. The neighbors who had come to gawk at disaster fell silent when they climbed those stairs and felt what he had known all along, that sometimes love builds what logic cannot. Wait, before the next confession unfolds, if this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. Part 1. The Promise and the Madness. 3 years earlier, Thomas Whitmore had been an ordinary man. A widower, yes, but ordinary nonetheless. A carpenter of some renown in the valley settlements of Western Virginia, known for straight walls and honest joinery. His daughter Eleanor was 17 then, bright-eyed and healthy, promised to the blacksmith's son, with a future as clear as spring water. Then came the fever. It swept through the valley like a thief, taking the old and the young with equal cruelty. Eleanor survived, but what the fever left behind was worse than death to those who loved her. Her lungs, the doctor said, were damaged beyond repair. She would live, perhaps, but she needed warmth, constant, gentle warmth, or the next winter would finish what the sickness had started. Move south, the doctor advised, packing his bag with the air of a man who had delivered a sentence. To the Carolinas, perhaps, somewhere the cold cannot reach her. But Thomas had no money for moving south. He had no family in warmer country, no prospects, nothing but his tools and the 40 acres his grandfather had cleared from wilderness. The land held his wife's grave, his workshop, the barn he'd raised with his own father 30 years before. And it held Eleanor, growing thinner with each autumn wind. The blacksmith's son married another girl that spring. No one blamed him. Eleanor herself had released him from her promise, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes accepting what everyone knew. She was dying by degrees, and no love could keep a young man chained to that slow grief. Thomas watched his daughter fade through the summer. He watched her sit by the window, wrapped in every quilt they owned, still shivering. He watched her smile bravely when he came in from the workshop, pretending she wasn't afraid. He watched her prepare for death with the quiet dignity of one who has no choice. And then, in September, as the first cold began to creep down from the mountains, she found him in the workshop at midnight. "Papa," she said, and her voice was so small. "I'm not ready. I know I should be. I know it's selfish, but I'm not ready to leave you." He held her then, this girl who was all he had left of the woman he'd loved, and he made a promise that everyone, including Eleanor herself, knew was impossible. "You won't die," he told her. "I'll build you warmth. I'll build you summer in the middle of winter. I swear it on your mother's grave." She'd smiled at that, sad and loving, the way one smiles at beautiful lies. But Thomas Whitmore had not been lying. The idea came to him 3 nights later, struck him like lightning while he stood in the barn at dusk. The building was solid, 40 feet long and 20 wide, with good bones and a sound foundation. Above, the loft stretched empty except for hay. Heat rises, he thought. Heat rises and animals make heat, and if heat rises... The plan formed in his mind like a blueprint drawn by invisible hands. He would build a cabin atop the barn, not beside it, not near it, but directly on top of it, its floor the ceiling of the barn below. In winter, he would fill the barn with animals, cattle, horses, sheep, whatever he could buy or barter for. Their bodies would generate heat, constant and gentle, rising through the floorboards into the cabin above. The cabin itself would be small, tight, perfectly insulated, designed to hold every degree of warmth like a precious thing. It was brilliant. It was insane. The next morning, he began to build. The neighbors came to watch, at first curious, then concerned, then openly mocking. Jacob Mills, who owned the adjacent property, was the first to laugh. "Whitmore's finally lost his mind," he announced at the general store. "Building a house on top of a barn like some kind of fool bird making a nest on a bear's back." The laughter spread. Children were brought to see the madness. Women whispered prayers for his sanity. Men shook their heads and spoke in pitying tones about grief breaking stronger men than Thomas. The minister came to counsel him. "Thomas," he said gently, "this is not the way. You cannot build your daughter's survival from lumber and nails. You must trust in the Lord's plan." "The Lord gave me hands," Thomas replied, hammering another joist into place. "I plan to use them." The construction took 6 weeks of dawn to darkness labor. Thomas worked like a man possessed, and perhaps he was, possessed by love, by desperation, by a promise that had become more sacred than prayer. He used every skill he had honed over 30 years, every trick of joinery and insulation he had ever learned or imagined. The cabin was a masterwork of efficiency, 12 feet by 16 feet, with walls packed with sawdust for insulation, windows double-paned and tight-fitted, a small iron stove for additional heat if needed. The floor was double-laid with an air gap between, designed to capture and hold the warmth rising from below. Beneath, in the barn, he modified the ventilation, created channels for airflow, designed the animal pens to maximize heat generation while maintaining the animal's health. He calculated, adjusted, rebuilt sections 3 times over when they didn't meet his exacting standards. Eleanor watched from the house, wrapped in blankets, her faith in her father absolute, even as her body grew weaker. She never mocked, never doubted. She simply waited and hoped, and tried not to cough too hard when he was near enough to hear. By late October, the cabin was finished. Thomas carried Eleanor up the stairs himself, stairs he'd built with treads exactly the right height for her weakened legs, and laid her in the bed he'd crafted from cherry wood, smooth as silk. "Rest now," he said. "Feel." She was silent for a long moment, her eyes closed. Then they opened, wide with wonder. "Papa," she whispered, "I'm warm." It was true. The cabin held heat like a gentle embrace, not the harsh blast of a close fire, but a subtle, pervasive warmth that seemed to rise from the very floor itself. Below, in the barn, Thomas had installed 4 dairy cows, 2 horses, a dozen sheep. Their combined body heat, exactly as he'd calculated, rose through the carefully designed floor and filled the space above. That night, for the first time in a year, Eleanor slept without shivering. The neighbors, of course, assumed it was temporary madness bearing temporary fruit. They waited for the scheme to fail, for reality to assert itself, for Thomas to finally accept what they all knew. You cannot cheat death with carpentry. But November came, and Eleanor grew stronger. December arrived with bitter cold, and still she thrived, spending her days in the warm cabin, reading, sewing, even laughing. By January, she could take short walks outside, bundled in furs, her cheeks showing color for the first time in months. The neighbors stopped laughing, but they didn't start believing. Coincidence, they said. A good winter. The fever simply running its course. They wouldn't give Thomas the satisfaction of admitting they'd been wrong. But Jacob Mills, whose property bordered Thomas's, began to notice something strange. On the coldest nights of February, when frost painted the windows and wolves howled in the hills, he would look across the snow-covered fields and see Thomas's barn glowing with lamplight, and above it, the little cabin sat like a crown, its windows radiating a golden warmth that seemed impossible. One night, driven by curiosity he would later deny, Jacob crept close enough to feel the air around the structure. Even outside, in the bitter cold, the barn itself felt warm to the touch. The snow melted in a perfect circle around the foundation. It shouldn't work, he thought. By all laws of nature and reason, it shouldn't work. But it did. Part 2. The Winter of Miracles. As winter deepened, something unexpected began to happen. The warmth of Thomas's impossible cabin started to spread in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. It began with Martha Green, a widow from 2 farms over, who came in late February with her grandson. The boy, barely 5 years old, had been coughing for weeks, the same rattling cough that presaged what had nearly killed Eleanor. "I know you'll think me foolish," Martha said, standing in Thomas's workshop with her hat in her hands. "But I heard, that is, Eleanor seems so well now, and I thought, might the boy spend some time in the warm, just during the day while I do my washing?" Thomas looked at the child, small and pale, and saw his daughter as she had been a year before. "Bring him every day," he said. "There's room." The boy came, and within 2 weeks his cough had eased. Within a month he was running through the snow, pink-cheeked and healthy. Word spread the way it does in small communities, quietly at first, then like water finding its path. By March, Thomas found himself with an unexpected vocation. Parents brought sick children. Old folks with aching bones came to sit in the warmth. Even animals were brought. A farmer's prize mare struggling through a difficult pregnancy. A shepherd's favorite dog, grown old and stiff with cold. Thomas turned no one away. Eleanor, blooming in the constant warmth like a flower in an unexpected spring, became the cabin's gentle mistress. She would sit with the children, telling them stories. She would hold the hands of the elderly, listening to their tales of younger days. She would stroke the animals, speaking soft words of comfort. The cabin became something more than shelter. It became a haven, a place where the valley's most vulnerable found respite from the cruel mathematics of winter. But not everyone saw it as a blessing. Jacob Mills watched with increasing unease. His wife, Sarah, had begun spending her afternoons at the cabin, claiming her joints felt better in the warmth. His own son had asked why they couldn't build something similar, a question that Jacob interpreted as a criticism of his own provision. Pride is a strange thing. It can make a man see threat in another's kindness, competition in another's gift. "It's not natural," Jacob said at the general store, his voice carrying the weight of a man trying to convince himself. "Heat rising from animals, warming a whole house, there's something unholy about it." A few heads nodded. The minister, who had been examining seed packets, turned slowly. "Unholy?" Reverend Porter said. "In what way?" "It defies the natural order. We're meant to suffer in winter, to be tested by hardship. That's what makes us strong, makes us faithful. This comfort, it's a deception." Or, the minister said mildly, "It's an act of love expressing itself through ingenuity. God gave us minds as well as souls, Jacob. Perhaps Thomas is simply using his gift." But the seed was planted. In a community bound by tradition and wary of change, Thomas's success had become a problem. The very warmth that saved his daughter was now a light that made other men's shadows seem darker by comparison. In early April, as the worst of winter began to break, a traveling preacher arrived in the valley. His name was Silas Cord, and he carried with him the particular certainty of men who mistake volume for truth. He preached on Sunday about false prophets and the dangers of seeking earthly comfort. He spoke of how Satan himself could appear as an angel of light, offering warm houses and healing as a trap for the unwary soul. He never mentioned Thomas by name. He didn't need to. After the service, a delegation approached Thomas's farm. Jacob Mills led them, though he kept his eyes downcast, not quite willing to meet Thomas's gaze directly. "We've been talking," Jacob said, "and we think, that is, Reverend Cord believes, there should be an investigation." "An investigation of what?" Thomas asked, genuinely confused. "Of your barn, your cabin, the warmth, where it comes from." Thomas stared at them for a long moment, these men he'd known his entire life, now standing on his property like strangers bearing suspicion instead of goodwill. "It comes from cattle," he said finally. "From horses and sheep. From the heat their bodies produce, channeled upward through a carefully designed floor. I've explained this a dozen times." "But it works too well," said another man, Peter Cross, whose mother had spent 3 weeks in the cabin recovering from a winter ague. "Nothing works this well without something else." "Something else?" Thomas's voice was quiet, dangerous. "Say what you mean, Peter." The men shuffled, uncomfortable. Finally, Jacob spoke the thought they'd all been circling. "There are some who wonder if you've made a bargain with forces that aren't of God." The accusation hung in the spring air like smoke. Eleanor, who had been sitting on the porch, stood up. She was still thin, still fragile, but there was steel in her spine as she walked to her father's side. "You think my father is a witch?" She said it calmly, almost amused. "That he sold his soul to save my life?" "We're not saying," Jacob began. "Yes, you are. You're saying exactly that." Her voice remained steady. "My father built a barn when he was 14 years old. He's built half the houses in this valley. He understands wood and air and heat the way you understand your own fields, Jacob. There's no magic here, just knowledge and love and work. Then let Reverend Cord examine it, Jacob said. If there's nothing unholy, you have nothing to fear. Thomas felt the rage building in his chest, the pure, righteous anger of a man who has given everything and received suspicion in return. But Eleanor's hand found his, squeezed gently. "Let him look," she said quietly. "Let them all look. The truth has nothing to hide." So it was arranged. Reverend Cord, accompanied by half the valley's men, would inspect the barn and cabin the following day. They would determine, with whatever wisdom they possessed, whether Thomas Whitmore's warm floors came from ingenuity or from darkness. That night, Thomas stood in the barn among his animals, listening to their gentle breathing, feeling the warmth they generated. He had built this with his own hands. He had saved his daughter with nothing but knowledge earned through years of careful observation and desperate love. And now he would have to defend it against the very people he'd helped. Above him, in the cabin, Eleanor lay awake, warm and alive, and terrified that tomorrow might take away the only thing keeping her from the grave. The animals shifted in their stalls, generating their patient, innocent heat. The warmth rose through the floorboards like a prayer. And in the valley, Reverend Silas Cord sharpened his rhetoric for the morning's investigation, certain he would find evidence of the devil's work in a carpenter's kindness. Part 3. The Investigation and the Fire. They came at dawn, a congregation of judgment wrapped in the righteousness of the uncertain. Reverend Cord led them, his black coat stark against the spring mud, his Bible held before him like a shield. Behind him came 20 men, some sheepish, some eager, all caught in that dangerous current of collective suspicion that can turn neighbors into strangers overnight. Thomas met them in the yard, Eleanor beside him despite his protests. She had insisted, and he had learned long ago that his daughter possessed a strength that her fragile body disguised. "Well, begin with prayer," Reverend Cord announced, not asking permission, not acknowledging Thomas beyond a curt nod. They prayed, or rather, Cord prayed while the others bowed their heads and Thomas stood silent, refusing to participate in the sanctification of this invasion. Eleanor, he noticed, kept her eyes open too, watching the men with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Now," Cord said, finishing his prayer with a theatrical flourish, "let us examine this structure." They entered the barn first, and Thomas watched their faces as they took in the reality of his design. The cattle in their pens, contentedly chewing hay. The horses, calm in their stalls. The sheep in their corner, wool thick with winter growth not yet sheared. All of them generating the simple, biological warmth of living bodies. Cord paced the length of the barn, examining the walls, the floor above, the ventilation channels Thomas had designed. He ran his hands along the beams, searching for what? Carved symbols, hidden talismans, evidence of a bargain scrawled in blood? He found good joinery and honest wood. "The ceiling," Cord said, pointing upward. "Explain how the heat moves through it." Thomas explained, his voice flat and patient, the mechanics of convection, the properties of different woods, the careful calculation of gaps and channels that allowed warm air to rise while preventing drafts.
"And these animals," Cord continued, "they are ordinary beasts, not enhanced by any means." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "They're cows, Reverend. They eat grass and produce milk and warmth, as cows have done since God created them." A few of the men shifted uncomfortably. Even in the grip of suspicion, the absurdity of interrogating cattle was apparent. "Let us see the cabin above," Cord announced. They climbed the stairs in procession, boots thudding on the steps Thomas had built to be gentle for his daughter's weakened legs. The door opened, and they crowded into the small space. Immediately, several of the men exhaled in surprise. The warmth was undeniable, a gentle, pervasive heat that rose from the floorboards themselves, making the cabin feel like a summer afternoon, even as spring frost still lingered outside. Cord moved through the room, examining everything. The iron stove in the corner, cold, unused. The windows,
tight-fitted but ordinary. The bed, the table, the chair, all simple, all crafted with skill, but bearing no mark of anything beyond a carpenter's trade. The floor, Cord said. This is where the deception lies. It's not deception, Eleanor said quietly. It's design. Cord ignored her. He knelt, pressing his hands to the floorboards, feeling the warmth radiating upward. No ordinary floor would hold heat like this. There must be something beneath, something hidden. Sawdust, Thomas said, between 2 layers of wood with an air gap to capture rising heat. I've explained this. Sawdust, Cord repeated, his tone suggesting Thomas had claimed it was ground unicorn horn. Sawdust is used for insulation throughout the country, Reverend, said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Standing there, muddy from travel, was Dr. Harrison, the physician who had first told Thomas to move south, who had pronounced Eleanor's condition all but fatal. Dr. Harrison, Eleanor breathed, surprised. We didn't know you were in the valley.
I came to check on my patient, Harrison said, stepping into the cabin. I heard she'd made a remarkable recovery. I wanted to see for myself. His eyes swept the room, taking in the gathered men, the atmosphere of inquisition. What's happening here? An investigation, Cord said stiffly, into whether there are unnatural forces at work. Harrison's eyebrows rose. Unnatural forces in a well-designed barn. He moved to the floor, knelt beside Cord, and pressed his own hand to the boards. Remarkable, he said, but not supernatural. I've read about similar principles in European agricultural journals. The French, I believe, have experimented with using stable heat to warm greenhouses. This is simply an application of that principle to human habitation. You've read about it? Jacob Mills asked, hope and disappointment warring in his voice. Yes, the science is sound. Animal bodies generate heat. Heat rises. Proper insulation captures and holds it. Mr. Whitmore has simply executed the principle with extraordinary skill. Harrison stood, brushing off his knees. As for Miss Eleanor's recovery, I attribute it to consistent warmth allowing her damaged lungs to heal without the constant stress of fighting cold. It's medicine, gentlemen, not magic. Reverend Cord's face had gone rigid, and yet the speed of her recovery is unusual but not impossible. I've seen similar cases where environment made the crucial difference. Harrison looked directly at the preacher. I'm a man of science, Reverend, but also a man of faith. I see God's hand in Mr. Whitmore's ingenuity, not the devil's. The tension in the room shifted. Several of the men looked relieved, ready to accept this rational explanation and go home. But Cord wasn't finished.
He said, his voice rising, why Thomas Whitmore's success should shine so brightly when others suffer. Why should his daughter live when others die? Why should his design work when it defies common practice? Pride, he said, turning to address the gathered men. Pride and the appearance of miracles are the devil's favorite tools. This man has made himself into a savior when we have only one savior. Enough! The word came from Eleanor, but it carried the force of her father's strength and her mother's unwavering faith. She stood, small and thin in the warm room, and faced the preacher with eyes that had looked at death and decided to live anyway. You want to know why this worked? I'll tell you. Because my father loves me more than he fears failure. Because he studied and planned and built with his own hands instead of simply accepting what others said was impossible. Because he had the courage to try something new when old methods had failed. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, filling the small cabin. You call it pride. I call it love. You call it defying common practice. I call it refusing to let your daughter die when there's any chance, any hope, any possibility of saving her. And if that's a sin, Reverend Cord, then I'll answer for it gladly when I stand before God, which would have been last winter if not for this barn, this cabin, and my father's refusal to give up. Silence fell like snow. Then Jacob Mills cleared his throat. Eleanor's right, he said quietly. Sarah's been saying the same thing to me for weeks. I let envy speak louder than sense. Thomas, I apologize. One by one, several other men echoed the sentiment. Not all. Some still looked uncertain, still caught in Cord's web of suspicion. But enough. Enough to break the spell. Reverend Cord stood rigid, his certainty cracking.
Then he turned and left without another word, his footsteps heavy on the stairs.
The remaining men dispersed gradually, some stopping to shake Thomas's hand, others simply leaving in embarrassed silence. Dr. Harrison stayed behind, examining Eleanor with professional thoroughness. "Remarkable," he said finally. "Your lungs have healed more than I thought possible. Continue as you are. Stay warm, avoid strain. You may yet have a full life ahead of you." After Harrison left, Thomas and Eleanor stood alone in the warm cabin. "You were magnificent," Thomas said softly. "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted. "But I've been dying for a year, Papa. Being afraid of Reverend Cord seemed silly in comparison." They laughed then, the slightly hysterical laughter of those who've survived something they shouldn't have. That night, Thomas slept soundly for the first time in weeks, secure in the knowledge that the investigation was over, the threat past. He should have known better. At 3 in the morning, Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke. She stumbled from her bed, her heart hammering, and threw open the cabin door. Below, in the barn, flames were already consuming the hay in the western corner. She could hear the animals screaming, smell the horrible tang of burning wood and terror. "Papa!" she screamed. "Papa, fire!" Thomas bolted from the main house in his nightshirt, saw the flames and ran for the barn without hesitation. Eleanor descended the stairs as fast as her weak legs could carry her, arriving just as her father burst through the barn doors into the smoke. The next minutes were chaos. Thomas released the animals, driving them out into the night while flames climbed the walls. Neighbors, roused by the commotion, came running with buckets. But it was clear the barn was lost. The fire had too much of a head start, had been set too well. Set. Even in the panic, Thomas recognized the pattern. The fire had started in 3 places simultaneously: western corner, eastern corner, near the stairs. This was no accident, no lantern tipped by careless animals. This was murder, dressed as mishap. He barely got the last sheep out before the roof began to collapse. Men pulled him back, held him while he struggled to return, to save something, anything. But then someone shouted, pointing upward. The cabin still stood. Flames licked around its base, smoke billowed beneath it, but the structure itself remained intact, perched on the burning barn like a miracle. "Eleanor!" Thomas screamed, suddenly remembering his daughter had been upstairs. "I'm here, Papa." She stood at the edge of the crowd, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her, her face streaked with soot and tears. "I got out. I got out when you went in." They held each other while the barn burned, while the heat that had saved Eleanor's life radiated out in one final, terrible bloom. By dawn, only the stone foundation remained. The barn was ash and charred timber. The animals had survived, huddled in a confused group at the far end of the pasture. And the cabin, impossibly, remained. Scorched, smoke-damaged, but structurally sound. It sat on the ruined foundation like a tombstone, marking where Thomas Dream had died. Jacob Mills stood at the edge of the crowd, his face gray. "Thomas," he said, "I swear to you, I didn't—" "I know," Thomas said. His voice was empty, exhausted. "You're not capable of this, Jacob." But someone was. Someone had decided that if investigation couldn't stop Thomas Whitmore's miracle, fire would. As the sun rose over the ruins, painting the sky the color of embers, Eleanor began to cough. The first real cough in months, rattling and deep. The sound of damaged lungs reminded what cold felt like. Winter was coming again, as it always did. And Thomas had nothing left to fight it with. Part 4. Rising from Ash. The valley held its breath. For 3 days after the fire, Thomas sat in his workshop, staring at the tools on the wall. He didn't sleep. He barely ate.
Eleanor brought him broth that grew cold while he gazed at nothing, his mind circling the same impossible problem. How to rebuild what had taken 6 weeks before, and rebuild it before the cold returned, with no money and no materials beyond what the valley might provide. On the 4th day, Jacob Mills appeared in the workshop doorway. "I can't give you back what was burned," he said without preamble, "but I can give you lumber. I've got oak aging in my shed, meant for my son's house, but he can wait another year." Before Thomas could respond, Peter Cross arrived with a wagon load of stone. "For the foundation," he said gruffly. "My quarry's got more than I need." By noon, a dozen men had brought materials, tools, offers of labor. They came quietly, many unable to meet Thomas's eyes, carrying the weight of their earlier suspicion like stones. Dr. Harrison arrived that afternoon, having delayed his departure from the valley. "I've sent letters," he announced, "to colleagues in Philadelphia and Boston, explaining your design. There's interest, significant interest in the principles you've employed. Several have sent money, asking for detailed plans they might adapt for hospitals and sanitariums." He handed Thomas an envelope thick with bills. "I can't take charity," Thomas said automatically. "It's not charity. It's payment for intellectual property. Your design could save thousands of lives in institutions across the country. These men are investors, not philanthropists." Harrison smiled. "Though I won't lie, the story of your daughter's recovery has touched many hearts. The money comes with admiration, Thomas. Accept it as such." But it was Eleanor who truly set things in motion. She appeared in the workshop that evening, carrying a notebook Thomas recognized, her mother's recipe book, filled with careful handwriting and kitchen wisdom. Except Eleanor had added pages, covered them with her own neat script. "What's this?" Thomas asked. "Names," Eleanor said simply.
Every person who came to the cabin this winter, every child who stopped coughing, every elder whose joints stopped aching, every animal that survived because of the warmth you built. I wrote them all down with notes about their conditions and recoveries." She opened the book, showed him page after page of careful documentation. "Dr. Harrison says this is evidence," she continued, "medical evidence of your design's effectiveness. But more than that, Papa, it's a list of people who owe their lives or their loved ones' lives to what you created. They know who set that fire. Maybe not a name, but they know it was fear and envy that struck the match, and they're not going to let those things win." That night, a town meeting was called. Not by the minister, not by the selectmen, but by Martha Green, the widow whose grandson had recovered in Thomas's cabin. The meeting house was packed. Reverend Cord sat in the front row, his face a mask. Jacob Mills stood at the back, as if ready to flee. And Thomas entered with Eleanor on his arm, both of them worn but unbowed. Martha stood before the assembly. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite her age, "about what happened 4 nights ago and what we're going to do about it." "The fire was investigated," Court said immediately. "The selectmen determined it was an accident." "The selectmen determined it was convenient to call it an accident," Martha interrupted. 3 ignition points, Reverend. Shall we ask the volunteer fire brigade what they think about that?" A murmur ran through the crowd. The fire brigade's chief, a grizzled farmer named Samuel, stood. "It was arson," he said bluntly. "No question. Set deliberately, set professionally. Someone who knew what they were doing wanted that barn gone." "That's a serious accusation," Cord said, his voice tight. "Do you have evidence of who—" "I'm not interested in who," Martha cut in, "though we all have our suspicions. I'm interested in what we do now."
Thomas Whitmore built something remarkable. He saved lives, including my grandson's, and someone tried to destroy it because they couldn't understand it, or couldn't bear that someone had succeeded where they'd failed. She turned to face the crowd directly. "So here's what I propose. We rebuild, together. Not just Thomas's barn, but something bigger. A community structure, a warming house for the whole valley. We use Thomas's design, his knowledge, and we build something that can shelter everyone who needs it when winter comes." The room erupted in conversation, some voices approving, others uncertain, a few hostile. "You're talking about a significant expense," said one of the selectmen. "The town treasury isn't being asked to pay for it," Dr. Harrison interjected, standing. "I have commitments from medical institutions for enough funding to build a structure twice the size of Thomas's original barn. They want a demonstration project, something they can study and potentially replicate. Your valley has the opportunity to house not just a warming barn, but a prototype that could change how we care for the vulnerable across the nation." "And what does Thomas get out of this?" Jacob Mills asked, his voice carrying a note of the old suspicion. "Seems like he'd be giving away his ideas for nothing." Thomas stood slowly. The room fell silent. "I get to keep my daughter alive," he said simply. "I get to see other fathers not have to make the choice I made between poverty and watching their children die.
I get to know that something good came from the worst year of my life." He paused. "The design isn't mine to hoard. It's just physics and carpentry. Anyone could have thought of it if they'd been desperate enough." "But no one did," Eleanor said, standing beside him. "You did, Papa, because you refused to accept that suffering was inevitable." Sarah Mills, Jacob's wife, rose from her seat. "I'll donate 2 months of my egg money," she announced, "and my time, whatever labor is needed." Peter Cross stood.
"My quarry will provide all the stone at cost." One by one, people stood, offering money, materials, labor, time. Not everyone. Reverend Cord sat rigid and silent, along with a handful of others whose pride or fear kept them bound. But enough. More than enough. By the end of the meeting, they had commitments for a new structure, a barn and warming house combined, large enough to shelter 20 people in the cabin above and house 40 animals below. Construction would begin in 2 weeks, as soon as materials could be assembled. Thomas would oversee the design, working with a team of the valley's best builders. And in a surprising turn, Martha Green proposed that the structure be dedicated not to Thomas, but to his late wife, Catherine. "Let it be Catherine's house," she said, "a place of warmth and mercy, named for the woman who raised a daughter strong enough to face down prejudice and a husband wise enough to build impossible things." The vote was unanimous among those willing to vote. As the meeting dispersed, Reverend Cord approached Thomas. His face was drawn, aged by the evening's events. "I didn't set the fire," he said quietly. "I want you to know that. I believed I was protecting the community from pride, from false miracles, but I was wrong. About you, about your work, I let certainty blind me to compassion." "Did you know who did it?" Thomas asked. Cord hesitated, then nodded slightly. "I have suspicions. A man came through the valley last week after our investigation. He was agitated, said that men like you who put their own wisdom above God's plan were dangerous. I may have encouraged that thinking. I didn't tell him to burn anything, Thomas, I swear that. But I created the soil where that seed could grow." "His name?" "He wouldn't give one. Left the valley the night of the fire. I doubt we'll see him again." Thomas looked at this man who had nearly destroyed everything, who now stood before him with guilt etched in every line of his face. "Help us build," Thomas said finally. "That's how you make this right. Not with confession, but with construction." Cord nodded, tears in his eyes, and walked into the night. The next morning, construction began. It was spring now, and the work progressed with the urgency of men who knew winter would return. Thomas designed as he built, adapting his original plans to the larger scale, incorporating improvements he'd imagined during the long winter nights. The barn rose from the ashes of the old one, larger and more sophisticated. He designed separate sections for different animals, optimizing each for heat generation while maintaining health and comfort. He created a revolutionary ventilation system that could be adjusted based on outside temperature. He built in redundancies, backup systems, ways to maintain warmth even if one section failed. Above, the cabin became a proper house, multiple rooms, space for families, for the sick, for the elderly. Windows that could be shuttered tight or opened wide. A central area with benches and tables where people could gather. Private quarters for those who needed solitude to heal. Dr. Harrison visited weekly, bringing not just money but also medical colleagues who wanted to observe and learn. Thomas found himself explaining principles of thermodynamics to physicians from Boston, demonstrating airflow patterns to hospital administrators from Philadelphia. Eleanor, regaining strength in the spring warmth, became the project's documentarian. She sketched, wrote detailed descriptions, interviewed everyone involved in the construction. Her notebooks became a comprehensive record of the building process, knowledge that would spread far beyond their small valley. By midsummer, the structure was complete. Catherine's house stood like a cathedral of practical compassion, its clean lines and efficient design somehow beautiful in their purpose. The dedication was held on a warm August afternoon. Nearly the entire valley attended,
along with visitors from 3 states who had heard about the project. Dr. Harrison gave a speech about medical innovation. Martha Green spoke about community resilience. Thomas said only a few words. My wife Catherine believed that love was something you built with your hands as much as your heart. This house is that belief made real. May it serve those who need it for generations to come. As autumn approached, the first residents arrived. A family whose child had the same lung condition Eleanor had survived. An old woman whose joints couldn't bear another winter of cold. They moved into Catherine's house, into rooms warmed by the gentle heat of animals below, and they thrived. When the first snow fell in November, Eleanor stood in her father's workshop, healthy and strong, and looked out at the structure they'd built from ash and hope. Do you ever wonder, she asked, what mother would think of all this? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I think, he said finally, she'd say we did good work. And then she'd ask what we're building next. Eleanor laughed, the sound clear and bright, the laugh of someone who had been given back their future. What are we building next, Papa? Thomas smiled. I've been thinking about greenhouses. If heat can keep people warm, why not use it to grow food through winter? There's a farmer 2 valleys over who's been having trouble with late frosts. Part 5. The Legacy of Warmth. Winter came to the valley like an old friend now, expected and no longer feared. Catherine's house stood against the first real cold of December, smoke rising from its chimneys, not from heating fires, but from the kitchen where residents cooked communal meals. The warmth came from below, as always, patient and reliable as prayer. Eleanor moved through the house in the early morning, checking on the residents. The child with damaged lungs slept peacefully, color in his cheeks.
The old woman sat by a window, knitting in comfort she'd never known in her own cold cabin. A pregnant woman, brought here by her worried husband when she'd started showing signs of winter sickness, rested with blankets loose around her shoulders instead of clutched tight against chill. Good morning, Eleanor, the woman said. I felt the baby move this morning. Strong kicks. I think the warmth agrees with both of us. Eleanor smiled, made a note in her journal. She still kept meticulous records, documenting not just the residents' health, but the house's performance. Temperature readings, fuel consumption, animal welfare, human recovery rates. The data was requested monthly by 3 different medical institutions now, each studying how environment affected healing. Below, in the barn, Thomas moved among the animals, 30 head of cattle now, plus horses, sheep, even a small section for pigs whose body heat was surprisingly efficient. He designed rotations so no animal was overburdened, and the local farmers had learned they could actually improve their stock's health by boarding them here through the deepest cold. Mr. Whitmore? A young man stood at the barn entrance, nervous. I'm Daniel Cross, Peter Cross's nephew. I've been studying engineering at the college in Richmond, and I heard about your design. I was hoping, that is, I'd like to learn how you built this, if you'd be willing to teach me. Thomas looked at this eager face, saw himself 30 years ago, hungry for knowledge. You'll need to take notes, he said, and the work starts at dawn. By afternoon, Daniel was measuring angles and calculating load distribution, his education meeting practical application in ways his professors had never demonstrated. He would be the first of many. By the following spring, Thomas would have a rotation of engineering students coming through, learning principles that would spread across the country.
But that afternoon, as Thomas taught Daniel about airflow and insulation, a rider came hard up the valley road. It was Jacob Mills, and his face was pale with panic. "Thomas!" he shouted, pulling his horse to a stop. "It's Sarah! She's collapsed! The doctor from town is snowed in. The pass is blocked. Will you come?" Thomas didn't hesitate. He delivered 4 calves and assisted at 3 human births in his life, had set bones and stitched wounds when necessity demanded. He grabbed a bag he'd assembled for emergencies and ran for Jacob's wagon. Eleanor intercepted them. "I'm coming too," she said in a tone that brooked no argument. They found Sarah in her bed, conscious but weak, her breathing labored. Eleanor examined her with the systematic approach Dr. Harrison had taught her.
She'd become something of a medical assistant over the past months, her careful observations earning the doctor's respect. Pneumonia, Eleanor said quietly. Early stage, but developing fast. We need to get her warm, Thomas said. Not hot, gentle, constant warmth. Her lungs need to work without fighting cold. Catherine's house? Jacob asked, desperate. Too far to move her safely in this condition. Thomas looked around the cold cabin, thinking. Then his eyes fell on Jacob's barn. How many animals do you have? 6 cows, 2 horses, some chickens. Good. We're going to modify your barn, today. What followed was a furious 4 hours of construction. Thomas directed Jacob, Daniel, and 2 neighbors who'd arrived to help in cutting vents in the barn ceiling, in building a platform bed directly above the animals, in hanging blankets to create an insulated chamber that captured rising heat. It was crude compared to Catherine's house, improvised and temporary. But by nightfall, Sarah lay on the platform bed, wrapped in quilts, with the gentle warmth of animals rising around her.
Eleanor stayed with her through the night, monitoring her breathing, giving her water, adjusting the ventilation as Thomas had taught her. By morning, Sarah's fever had broken. By the second day, she was sitting up. By the week's end, she was recovered. "You saved her life," Jacob said to Thomas as they stood in the modified barn. "I applied principles," Thomas replied, "the same ones that saved Eleanor. There's no magic here, Jacob, just heat and time and understanding how the body heals." But Jacob saw it differently. "You could have refused. After everything, my suspicion, my words at that meeting, you could have let your pride answer my panic." "Pride doesn't keep people warm," Thomas said simply, "and you've more than made up for doubt with your help these past months." That modified barn became the seed of something larger. By spring, 3 other families had asked Thomas to help them create similar systems. By the following winter, a dozen farms in the valley had warm spaces built on his principles. The valley itself was changing, becoming known not for what it feared, but for what it had learned. Visitors came, some seeking healing in Catherine's house, others seeking knowledge of the design. A few came seeking Thomas himself, wanting to commission buildings, to hire him for projects in distant cities. He turned most of them down. His place was here, in this valley, with his daughter and the community they'd built from ashes and determination. But he did accept one commission, a warming house for a children's hospital in Philadelphia, designed in collaboration with Dr. Harrison. The building would be 3 times the size of Catherine's house, incorporating everything Thomas had learned over 2 years of observation and improvement. Eleanor accompanied him to Philadelphia for the dedication. It was her first time seeing a real city, and Thomas watched her face light up with wonder at the crowds, the buildings, the endless possibilities.
"You could stay," he told her as they stood on the hospital steps, watching children play in a warm courtyard above horse stables. "Dr. Harrison would sponsor you." She was quiet for a long moment, watching a little girl with a familiar cough laugh as she ran. "I could," she agreed. "But not yet, Papa. There's still work to do at home, records to keep, patients to tend, your new students to teach proper note-taking." She smiled. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't work yourself to death building greenhouses." They returned to the valley in early spring, in time to see the first vegetables growing in the experimental greenhouse Thomas had built, warmed, naturally, by a small barn of rabbits below. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the main house, the cabin where Eleanor had nearly died now felt too small for daily living, so it had become storage while they'd built properly. Martha Green arrived with a package. "This came for you," she said, "from Boston." Inside was a journal, freshly printed, with an article titled Thermal Efficiency in Agricultural Structures, the Whitmore Method. Thomas's name was listed as primary author, though he'd never written a word of it. Dr. Harrison and his colleagues had compiled Thomas's verbal explanations and Eleanor's detailed notes into a formal paper. "You're famous," Martha said, grinning. "Well, famous among people who care about heating buildings efficiently anyway." Thomas read the paper, saw his thoughts and observations transformed into scientific language, his practical solutions elevated to principles. It felt strange, seeing his work described in such formal terms, as if he'd been trying to make history instead of simply trying to save his daughter. But Eleanor understood. "It's proof, Papa," she said that night, the paper spread on the table between them.
proof that love and knowledge together can change the world. That refusing to accept suffering as inevitable isn't pride, it's hope. Summer came, and with it Thomas's 50th birthday. The valley threw him a celebration held in Catherine's house, where dozens of people whose lives had been touched by his work gathered to honor him. Jacob Mills gave a speech, his voice breaking as he talked about Sarah's recovery. Martha Green presented Thomas with a quilt, each square sewn by someone who'd been helped by his design. Dr. Harrison announced that 5 more hospitals had committed to building warming houses based on Thomas's principles. But the gift that moved Thomas most came from Reverend Cord. The minister stood, looking older than his years, and held up a wooden box. Inside, carefully preserved, were the charred remains of a beans from the original barn. "I kept this," Cord said quietly, as a reminder of how certainty can blind us, of how fear can make us cruel, of how wrong we can be when we mistake our limitations for God's. He handed the box to Thomas, but also as a reminder that from ashes, with enough love and determination, something beautiful can grow. Cord had changed over the past 2 years. He still preached, but his sermons now spoke less of judgment and more of compassion, less of fearing the new and more of embracing the good. He'd become Catherine's house's most reliable volunteer, spending his afternoons reading to children and sitting with the elderly. As the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Eleanor found her father standing outside, looking up at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Your mother," he admitted, wishing she could see this. "See you, healthy and strong. See what came from that terrible year." Eleanor linked her arm through his. "I think she sees it, Papa. I think she's been watching all along." They stood in comfortable silence, the warmth of the party at their backs, the cool night air fresh and clean. "Daniel asked me something today," Eleanor said after a while.
He wanted to know if you ever regretted it. Building something so unconventional, facing all that suspicion and anger. What did you tell him? I told him you'd have to answer that yourself. Thomas considered the question. He thought about the fear, the exhaustion, the night of the fire when everything seemed lost. He thought about being called prideful, possibly in league with darkness, about standing before his neighbors and having his work, his love made manifest, questioned and condemned. Then he thought about Eleanor standing beside him, alive, about Sarah Mills recovering in a crude platform bed, about children playing in warm courtyards, old folks sitting comfortable instead of suffering, about students learning that compassion could be engineered as well as felt. "No," he said finally. "No regrets. Only gratitude that I had the skills to try and the stubbornness to keep trying when others said to stop." "And if you could go back," Eleanor pressed, "to that night when I asked you to save me, knowing everything that would follow?" Thomas looked at his daughter, this miracle of persistence and warmth, and smiled. "I'd build it bigger." Eleanor laughed, that clear, bright sound that had once seemed lost forever, and the sound carried across the valley, where it mingled with the gentle lowing of cattle in their barns, with the crackle of fires in warm houses, with the breathing of people sleeping safe from cold. Winter would come again as it always did, but the valley was ready now. More than ready. It was warm. And in a workshop by a rebuilt barn, plans were already being drawn for a new project, because Thomas Whitmore had learned that the best response to darkness wasn't to curse it, but to build something that generated light, or in his case, heat, which, when you thought about it, was just another form of light anyway, the kind that kept you alive through the longest nights. The kind that rose from the patient breathing of animals and the stubborn love of fathers. The kind that refused to let cold have the final word.